this spring term, we're having a bit of a focus on the intersection between identity and diagnosis, causing a number of challenges at the moment in clinical psychiatry, and they're very interesting subjects anyway. So this is what we are having a look at over the next at least couple of seminars. So it's my pleasure to welcome Sanneke de Haan, newly endowed professor of psychiatry and philosophy at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Sanneke has a background in phenomenology of psychopathology, which in this group we also have somewhat a background of interest in. So her research has looked at various different psychiatric conditions or diagnoses over the years, schizophrenia, OCD, and depression through a phenomenological lens, but she's also interested in models of mind. And Sanneke came, I first met Sanneke last year, and she came to the Trainees Phenomenology Reading Group to talk about her excellent book, Inactive Psychiatry, which was published in February of 2020, which has received acclaim as a very clear and compassionate presentation of the philosophical foundations for a scientifically informed non-reductionist framework for understanding psychiatric illness. Her current work is what she'll be talking to us about tonight. So without any further ado, I'll pass over to Sanneke. So thank you, Sanneke.
Thank you, Chloe, and thank you very much for the invitation. And hello, everybody, and thank you for joining. I'll start sharing my screen with you. Yes, so if that should be visible now. Yes, so I will talk today about my current research project on self-illness ambiguity and self-medication ambiguity for patients with recurrent depressions. It is still a work in progress, so I'm still working on analyzing the data, but nonetheless, there's already lots of, I think, interesting stuff. I hope interesting stuff to share with you. Oh, I have to see that it actually continues. Oh, it does now. Before I tell more about self-illness ambiguity and self-medication ambiguity, I want to sketch very roughly the background of this research for me and its relation to my earlier work on enactive psychiatry. I will also say very short bit about authenticity before going to discuss some preliminary results from my study. Right, so as Chloe mentioned, in 2020, I published a book on enactive psychiatry, and the whole aim of that book was basically to solve what I call psychiatry's integration problem. So to provide a theoretical foundation for a holistic approach to psychiatry. And there's four main dimensions that I suggested that we should integrate: the experiential dimension, physiological dimension, sociocultural dimension, and the existential dimension. And it's this latter dimension that I will be talking about also today. And with the existential dimension, I refer to the fact that people relate to their experience. They don't just experience things, but they also take a stance on these experiences. They an evaluative stance on these experiences also. And once that capacity is in place, the capacity to take a stance on things, this has some fundamental effects, I think, for what you could call your way of being in the world. Something that I obviously didn't invent. This is a common thought of characterizing the human condition from Plessner to Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger, and recently people like Charles Taylor, for instance. The existential dimension, I think this is a really helpful picture to sort of summarize what I mean. What I mean by that namely that you're not sort of confined to your experiences in the here and now, but that you can relate to those, and that this opens up a whole new dimension, basically, of being in the world. And this, I think, is important for psychiatry. So what I propose in the book, you could say it's sort of roughly a biopsychosocial model, plus this explicit existential dimension, and a story of how, or how do you say a story? Not really a story, but a substantiation, if you will, of how this can cohere. How do these relate? Because that's something I think that's in the biopsychosocial model remains a bit vague. So that's what I try to set out to do. And so, like I said, today I will focus on this existential stance. In psychiatry, this existential stance is, I think, important to explicitly mention because it's at stake in various ways in both the development and the persistence of psychiatric disorders. So it can, first of all, play a constitutive role in a disorder. So think, for instance, of the fear for the fear when you think of anxiety disorders or panic attacks. It's also psychiatric disorders can also affect one's stance taking. So think, for instance, of depression affecting not just your current experiences, but also your ability to take your stance taking itself has become depressed, so to say, or is colored by the depression, if you will. It can play many modulatory roles in different ways. So I listed some here. So, for instance, the way in which feeling shame for what you experience can cause people not to seek treatment or not to, or only in a very late stage. What Chloe just mentioned, that this is the topic of the coming talks, the relation to your diagnosis, the relation to the disorder. So what impact does it have to receive a diagnosis? How does that affect your self-understanding? How do you see your relationship to the disorder, or do you see it rather as something that belongs to you? This will be part of what I will talk about today as well. The relation to treatment, like, am I the kind of person who would take antidepressants or medication or something? There's all these existential considerations as well. And a relation to others, both in positive and negative ways in terms of stigma, but also in positive ways. So the specific phenomenon that I'm interested in within this existential domain now is self-illness and self-medication ambiguity. And that refers to was really nicely summed up by David Karp in his book, Is It Me or My Meds? Where he writes, if I experience something, is it because of the illness, the medication, or is it just me? And this is a question that I recognize to be of importance in the various kinds of qualitative researches that I did. So both with young schizophrenic patients, but also with people with OCD. And currently I'm interviewing people with recurrent depressions. So to get a little bit of more feel of the kind of phenomenon that I'm referring to, here are some examples of that. So in a paper by Tony Hope and colleagues with anorexia patients, they actually came across the relevance of authenticity very strikingly. And so they quote one participant who says, am I being anorectic because I'm not having a spread? Or is that me being perfectly capable of making my own decision about what I do and don't like? It is difficult to know. Or another participant who says, I will say something and my mom will, oh, this is actually not another participant, it's the same participant. I'll say something and my mom will turn around and say, that's the anorexia. And I'm like, oh, what? That's actually me. And she'll go, no, it's anorexia. So that in that respect, I get scared sometimes because I think, oh my God, I don't know who's who. So what is, so to say, the voice of anorexia and what is my own voice? Oh, it is a different participant. From this book from Karp, there's that's the book by Karp focuses mainly also on the relationship between the two medication, as the title indicates. And as one of his participants says, I don't feel like I'm the same person on drugs. I feel as though maybe I'm a better person, but it's not who I am. Or take this quote. This is from this is a pseudonym, Ruth Henry, who describes her relation to the diagnosis of depression. And she really struggles with that because she really feels, does that describe, do I have a disorder? Or is that just who I am? So what she writes is, I think I was born with the tendency to think pessimistically and to be overly sensitive and anxious. At what point did my temperament metamorphose into symptoms of a disease? Are they distinct or are they one and the same? It's a short paper, but I can really recommend it because it's so rich also in terms of that it's that she feels guilty, as it were, to accept a diagnosis because it feels as if she's getting away with what should actually be something that should be blamed for, and much more, but very recommendable. And finally, a final quote from a bipolar patient who says, I feel like everything I do now is somehow connected to my being sick. If I'm happy, it's because I'm manic. If I'm sad, it's because I'm depressed. I don't want to think that every time I have an emotion, every time I get angry at someone, it's because I'm ill. Some of my feelings are justified. So this is also a good example, I think, of the power of a diagnosis in terms of self-interpreting, interpreting your own experiences and how to make sense of them. Self-illness ambiguity was first coined by John Sadler in his paper, The Psychiatric Significance of the Personal Self. And I think it's helpful to distinguish explicitly also the self-medication ambiguity. Now, there's lots of research. This is actually not at all, how do you say, a conclusive overview. There's lots of research with qualitative research mostly on patients with a variety of psychiatric disorders that all point to the relevance of authenticity or questions around what is me and what is not me. What they have in common, I think it is different for different psychiatric disorders. There's slightly different types of issues. But what they do have in common is that they show that it really impacts someone's quality of life, as is understandable if you feel that, am I actually being myself or not? It's a really relevant question. And it also impacts treatment choices. So for instance, in terms of whether you want to take medication or not. So how to deal with these self-illness and self-medication ambiguities, and how to go about determining what's me and what's my disorder or what's my medication. This brings along a whole lot of trouble in itself, because the whole question of when are you yourself is really difficult question, where a lot has been written, at least from the philosophy side, but I think also from psychology sides, on this topic of authenticity and being yourself. What I want to highlight here, I just want to highlight a few aspects of these debates around authenticity. There's the common debates around, should authenticity, is this something that refers somehow to your ideal self or to your real self, who you are now or who you want to be? Is it a matter of something that you create or rather something that you discover? What I want to focus on here now is rather the question, what kind of self is presupposed in various notions of authenticity? So especially when you look at the discovery, sort of romantic model of authenticity, where you, for instance, the whole cult of the finding your inner voice or your inner child or so on. That's really, their authenticity presupposes that finding yourself, that this self is some sort of invariable, atomistic, and also transparent subject. Because when you do individual reflection, you should sort out, so to say, what's internal and what's external. And if you remove the sort of contaminating, I should say, external effects, then you should come to sort of your real inner voice and not be polluted, so to say, by voices of others trying to convince you of things. Well, I mean, there is something to say about that you should be careful of finding out what you really want rather than doing what someone else wants. Yet this whole picture of this atomistic kind of transparent self is really debatable. So from the sort of, at least from the sort of perspective where I'm coming from, it's much more likely sort of the picture that's from an activism, but also phenomenology, is that we are embodied, embedded beings, and also we change over time, and we can also be mistaken about ourselves. So the whole idea that there could be sort of a neutral point of view, a reflection, we should just reflect, just peer inside ourselves, and then we come to the truth of what we really want. That doesn't seem such a viable picture on this more relational and situational approach to selves. So that leaves two main challenges, because if you don't rely on inner outer to make the distinction of what's me and what's not me, then the question is, what then does authenticity refer to? And the other challenge is that if you don't accept reflection as some sort of view from nowhere, as Thomas Nagel would call it, if there's not such a neutral stance, then also again, how then do you go about determining what's authentic and what's not? And what's really remarkable, I think, there's so many theories of authenticity within philosophy, within sort of the field of philosophy, and yet it's really remarkable that they almost all rely on individual reflection to make the distinction between what is and isn't authentic. Now, I think that is problematic. Not just, and usually these, I think all of them, they have these kind of disclaimers for you can't rely on your reflection, for instance, when you have a psychiatric disorder, and then just throwing away a whole group of people sort of, well, but then you're not capable of doing this, but I'm not talking about that. But actually, I think it's very often the case that when you are struggling with what should I do? What actually fits me? Does this career fit me? Does this relationship fit me, and so on? In times of emotional upheaval, or when you're in love or whatever, individual reflection is more often, I think, not super reliable. So what I want to instead draw upon when talking about authenticity is a notion of relational authenticity. This term was coined by Sean Gallagher, Ben Morgan, and Naomi Rokotnitz in 2018. And they argue that when you think of people as relational selves, this requires a rethinking of what authenticity is. And what they say, it's relationships with others are not just something that you sort of should look to scrutinize in terms of how are these others affecting my pure self, but rather that sort of they are the unavoidable occasion for authenticity, like they say. And I think what's important also about this move or this different approach is that it also allows you to move away from this individual reflection as the only means to establish what is and isn't authentic, and that it also allows more relational strategies, which I think is very much in line with how we in fact go about when we worry about about our authenticity, that we talk to good friends, we talk to people who matter to us, or we look at examples of the people around us for ways of how can I do things differently. Right, so from this perspective, rather than this inner-outer idea, you can have, rather than picturing authenticity as self versus the alienating other, you could rather talk about own versus alien in terms of values, rather than having some sort of boundary transgression. And the other thing, like I said, is to move from individual reflection to what you could call socially scaffolded reflection, like, for instance, in the case of psychotherapy, I would say here. So as a working definition, and I'm happy to discuss, well, everything basically in the discussion, but I'm also happy to discuss this working definition, partly also based on the interviews that I did. I use a working definition that being yourself or living authentically means living your life in accordance to what matters to you, what you value. Excuse me. So finally, to some preliminary results of my study. The study consists of two parts. The first part is in-depth interviews with patients with recurrent major depressions. I already told that. And the second part will be that I will have focus groups with patients, loved ones broadly construed, to see how they experience these issues. And the goal is twofold. On the one hand, very practical. We have these psychoeducation meetings here in the Dutch mental health care system. And I would like to develop a sort of module about these issues. And more on a philosophical level, I want to further develop this concept of relational authenticity. But today I will only talk about this part, and also just a part of that, actually. But so the participants, I interviewed 18 people, 9 men, 9 women. They were recruited mainly through the patient organization, the depression organization. This is important, I think, to note, because that means that, I mean, not everyone, of course, is a member of such a patient organization. So that already means you have a certain relation to the disorder. That, I mean, someone who might be diagnosed with depression but wouldn't want to acknowledge it in that way would never be part of this organization. So I did recruit also some other patients, but mainly through this. Age range 27 to 69, all over the Netherlands. Duration of illness in between 5 and 39 years. So as I said, I'm still analyzing the data. It's very rich data, and I was struggling a bit with keeping within the time limits for today. I wanted to put so much quotes in, because I really liked it myself, but it was getting way too long. So I decided to just really be strict and just talk about the first 2 themes. I have also in slides, like in extra slides, I have more on the other elements as well. But so I will talk about these first 2 today. Self-illness ambiguity. There's a couple of themes that come to the fore when analyzing the data. The first is the development of the depression and the role of self-effacing behavior in the development of the depression. I will say a bit more about that later. There's the effect of chronically returning depression, that it's not just a one-off thing, but that it's recurrent in your life, that requires a different kind of stance towards than if it would just be a one-off episode or period. There's the role of how do you conceptualize the illness? What's your view on the disorder as something, as a brain disease or something that is rather sort of psychodynamically explained? And there's the attitude towards depression. I will say a bit more about that later too. And there are what I call the secondary effects of depression on life and identity, simply meaning that people have elaborate life manuals in order to prevent further depressions from occurring. And also the kind of decisions you make, knowing that you have a certain vulnerability, can have a huge impact on your life in terms of, do I see myself having a family? Do I think I'm capable of that? Is a certain career not too stressful? And there's all kinds of ways in which having depressions impacts these choices, which can have a sort of depressing effect in itself again. So what I will say a bit more about here is these two. First, to introduce this idea of the development of depression and self-behavior, I would like to use a case study of one of the people I interviewed. That is, I've called him John. These are all pseudonyms for anonymity reasons. John, when I met him, he had actually just come to accept, so to say, that he would not work again anymore. So he was originally he was a nurse, and now he was sort of not retired, but on continued sick leave. And he was really interested in he had been really occupied with trying to get to why did he have these recurrent depressions. And he told me about how he grew up, that his father was largely absent. His mother was very frail, both physically and psychologically, and he was the eldest son of 6 children. And the responsibility basically came to him to care for the other children, and he had to sort of be tough and take responsibility and care for his siblings. And caring was also what he did in his work as a nurse. And at several points during his career, he had what he called burnouts, mostly having to do with being overburdened with too much responsibilities and taking on too much at his work, too much tasks and so on. So, and then he had his first major depression 11 years ago, and he has used antidepressants since, with a short intermittent period in which he stopped using it and leading to another major depressive episode. So he said, I'm not gonna touch that anymore. That's too much. And so here are some quotes from him. He says, I've been very curious how my depressions have come about. And yes, I would say that is for a large part due to upbringing, to the family you come from. I'm sure now that my mother has actually been suffering from depression for years, but nobody acknowledged that at the time. And then there's the patterns that I taught myself and the behavior that I have incorporated, and they are now breaking me down. And yes, what is what, right? Is it something that is genetically part of you? Or is it learned behavior? Is it example behavior? It is, of course, a bit of everything, but you cannot put your finger on it like that led to that. I cannot tell what is cause and what is effect. So he basically sums up like all these elements are sort of different narratives you could tell about why this happened. It's like it's genetics through his mother, it's the upbringing. It may also be some of his personality traits like his perfectionism or his feeling responsible and so on. And he remarks, as the eldest, you easily get the responsibility to make sure that everything keeps going. Yes, so I've learned to always be self-effacing. That's what happened. Now I found this, I picked this quote, but I could picked lots of different quotes because it's really remarkable. Of course, this is in no sense a representative sample or anything. It's qualitative research. I've looked for diversity, not sort of representativeness, but I find it really, really remarkable that so many people tell me stories about how they grow up and how in different ways, how they've sort of not felt able to express themselves. Some emotions were not allowed in the family, or emotions at all were not allowed in the family. They had to adjust for various reasons. Often there are stories of basically too much often responsibility for young children. Some I think really what you could call traumatic upbringings. It's always a bit, in a sense, when you are constantly not able to express yourself. Yeah, you could also say that that's some sort of emotional neglect or trauma in itself. But so this was a remarkable finding I found, and also that this because it's so linked to expressing yourself that people sort of don't even know who they are. And as one of the participants put it, also coming from a very difficult family background, and he said that sort of shutting off all emotions was this is a survival strategy, but as he says, that leaves you empty. And he actually used the word flawed identity formation. I think that also means that he's been in several therapies, so maybe picked up some terms also in that respect. But he really felt that way. Yes, so about now, we can discuss this more, but this is something that I found remarkable that I wanted to share with you. Then the attitudes towards depression. It was also remarkable that many people told me about what they saw as a progress, basically, from fighting the depression to accepting it. And some people found some sort of middle ways in that regard. And I'll give you some quotes to illustrate that. So this is Claudia, who told me, yes, at some point I began to get tired of it. Always those thoughts, when will it pass? What should I do? What could I still try? And then I would try a new kind of medication, and then I'd get sick again. She had lots of side effects, difficulties. I always had the feeling that I had to justify that if I did not engage enough in therapies, as if I didn't do enough. But at some point I thought, I'm only busy trying to imagine myself in a different place than I am now. It's like you're a kind of work in progress because you are not good enough the way you are. And here is another participant, actually a very young participant. He was the 27-year-old, and he says, an important point for me, besides my medication that made things better, is that I stopped fighting against my depressive thoughts and my negative thoughts, and that I started to accept that these were just as much part of me as my positive side. It's the same coin as the positive side, but just the other side. And that has helped me immensely, because actually each tiny bit of energy I regained, I used for pushing those thoughts away. But it's no use. It's in your own head. You're fighting against yourself. And to see that and to just let it go, yes, that helped enormously. So now I say depression is a part of me. Another thing I want to remark here is that accepting actually can mean very different things for different people. So people can all say they accept the depression, but mean different things by it. So accepting the depression can just mean I have a certain illness and I have to adjust my life to it in certain ways, just like people with diabetes have to do that. Or like we saw with the quote from Matthijs, depression can be seen as the other side of the same coin of being a sensitive person, a perfectionist person, inclined to feel responsible, inclined to think about things a lot. And then there's people who see depression as a sort of warning signal, a sort of emergency brake from a sort of their body sort of pulling out the plug, like, okay, I'm going over my boundaries. And then there's people who not just see depression as a warning signal, but also as a warning signal that particularly calls for personal growth. So that sort of it's signals to you where there's still work to do, so to say. Okay, on to some points about self-medication ambiguity. when you talk with people with recurrent depressions about their depressions, a large part will be about medication, because it's so often and it's often long and difficult trajectories, finding something that has the least side effects and still works. People have very high thresholds for starting medication. They don't want to be dependent on something like that. They don't want to be the kind of person that has to rely on that. And then when you start, there are the side effects that can be very severe for some people. Then there is the issue of when is something a side effect, when is something a depressive symptom, and when is something me. And this particularly has to do, for instance, with the flattening of emotions is one of those examples. Like if you don't feel that much emotionally, that can be a side effect of the medication, but it could also be part of the depression, or it can be just who I am. There's the effect of long-term medication use, that people don't know so much anymore who they would be without medication, and are also, the impact that it has on that. And there's questions around, okay, medication can make me maybe function better, but is it also my real self? So some quotes to illustrate some aspects of it. So yes, this is actually what I just said. This is what Hans said about this. He said, does the medication really flatten my emotions, or do I do that? Am I not pretty emotionally flat myself, so to say? Because that's exactly the kind of techniques that I learned in order not to feel. I sometimes thought it would be nice if there would be a medicine that enabled you to gain better access to your emotions instead of flattening them, but I don't know if that exists. You could actually think here maybe of some form of treatment with, I think this is exactly what kind of treatment with mushrooms. I forgot the I forgot. I don't really know how to pronounce it and forgot the name. A specific type of mushroom treatment is exactly, I think, what this aims for. But, and here's Clarence saying that I don't know if the version of me on medication is the real me. It's a functioning version of me. And here is Claudia again, who says that I think I'm better off with my half a pill, because I said once that I'm constantly busy with self-management and paying attention. Oh, I don't feel well. Oh, I could say the wrong things. Oh, wait, what I feel now, should I be actually feeling that? Should I? Oh, no, it's the depression that produces these thoughts. Then I should better not act on them. And that's what can keep you occupied full time when you're depressed. And then you think, okay, and if you're depressed for a long time on end, and then you think, nothing I feel now I can actually take seriously. So who am I then? Yes, I've come up with some points of discussion myself, but like I said, I'm open to discuss other things as well. But these are some of the things. Oh, is it actually? Yes, it's a bit small. These are some of the things that interest me, or that I find, that interest me basically. So how intimate is the relation between depressions and being able to be yourself? Is indeed this sort of self-effacing or lack of self-expression during your upbringing, is this something that indeed is intimately related to depression, and that depression is really somehow about not being able to be yourself? Another thing that I think of in this regard is that everyone who grows up will be impacted by how they grow up and the people around them, and the kind of interaction patterns that they see around them. But you could maybe say that behavioral patterns that are acquired in sort of dysfunctional or even traumatic settings are less own than those acquired in functional environments. And I'm thinking here of something that's the more dysfunctional the environment, the more limited the type of reaction that is sort of allowed, or that is possible. That when you are so much focused on, as a child focused on the survival, then there's just this very small range of interaction patterns, maybe, that your ways of being in the world that you can have. Another thing that interests me is, so people make lots of adjustments in their life to make sure that they don't get depressions again. That, of course, then diminishes the opportunity to live in accordance to your values, or it has an impact on that. But on the other hand, I was thinking, yeah, is this really fundamentally different? I mean, from the constraints that we all have in certain ways. And I mean, I also need my sleep in order to function. Just, I mean, right. So this is a bit maybe not a good example, but well, maybe it is a good example that you just know through your life, okay, when I have to give a talk at some point, it's not a good, I couldn't just go go and drink before or something like that. Actually, I don't drink, so it's a bad example, but oh yeah, you get what I mean, I think. So, and also this whole distinction that some people make between, yeah, I'm functioning better, the functioning self or being yourself. What would be the difference? Would there be any differences? Yes, so these are some things that I'm curious to hear your feedback on. And thank you for your attention. I'll stop sharing.
Okay, great, Sanneke. Thank you so much for sharing that your work with us. Yeah, I'm aware that it's sort of work in progress at the moment, so it's really interesting to see how it's coming along, and we'll follow that, I'm sure. Good. Does anyone want to kick off the discussion with maybe a comment on one of those discussion points, or a question to Sanneke, or yeah, really something that came to mind as Sanneke was speaking. Quentin, you've appeared on the screen, so I'm assuming you're happy to say something.
Hi, Sanneke, thank you for that. That was really thought-provoking and very interesting. I suppose one question that springs to mind, which I think you raise very well, or that comes through the interviews with the patients very well, is the relationship between depression and authenticity, or between depression and what we might call personal truth, or the truth of one's life. So there's a kind of premise or assumption in a lot of CBT, it's sort of perhaps naively understood, but CBT orientations, that there are unhelpful thinking patterns which predispose to depression or perpetuate depression, negative automatic thoughts and so on, which aren't based in reality, which should be reappraised through Socratic questioning or other such techniques to bring people to a more sort of reasoned and considered alternative view of themselves, which is contributes less to depression. So there's a premise in that depression is associated with unrealistic thinking in some way, and that to recover from depression requires a more realistic reality orientation, if I could say that. But I do wonder actually if the situation is much more complex than that. And so I'll give you an example which I find very interesting. A psychiatrist I knew once told me about a case of an elderly Polish man who became depressed after his son died. And in the course of his depression, he began to think of a profoundly traumatic period in his life, which he'd never thought about before, virtually as though he'd forgotten it. But it was a period during the Second World War when the Nazis invaded his town or his village, and in order to survive, he went into a woods and was starving and freezing for several weeks, basically hiding. And thereafter, and he was profoundly preoccupied with this and very distressed, recalling this when he was depressed. Thereafter, but actually for much of his life, he hadn't devoted a thought to it. He'd basically forgotten it. He didn't think about it. So the question is, by virtue of his depression, was he enabled to recognize a profound trauma that he had not otherwise been able to think about or remember? So the depression had revealed something that really happened. So I'm just going to sort of just invite you to reflect on that in light of the work that you've been doing as well. Could I also add, actually, I'd be very interested to hear what a psychotherapist or a psychologist, who have a lot of experience working with people with depression. I'm sure that some of the people attending tonight have a lot of clinical experience of doing psychological work. How all of that is navigated because it must come up. But anyway, so I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, I really like your point that sort of and I do think it resonates with the stories that people, at least that I've heard. So this is of course limited experience and so on, but yet if you see depression as being meaningful, not just a random sort of case of sort of bad luck or chemistry mismatch or whatever, but actually as being meaningful, I think you can actually see that people that the depression, in a sense, but people tell me, I asked them also, I found that a very difficult question to ask, and I was being very polite about it and so on, but I also asked if they felt the depression had brought them something, or if it also had done something good for them. And as one of the participants said, well, I can say that, but if someone says to you, your depression was good for this and that, I would really want to kick them because it was so horrible. But actually, many people that I spoke to do feel that the depression has actually played all in all some sort of helpful role, especially with regard to this self-expression. So with regard to sort of self-development, and as a sort of that, people would tell me stories of how they would just be totally devoted to making life better for others, basically. Often it was stories of being very responsible, devoting their times to caring for others and so on. And then this sort of depression when it was just not possible anymore to do all of this. And it sort of forced them to recalibrate and to think, okay, this is not working. So in that sense, what you call the a revealing function of depression, for some people, at least, that was really the case. And one of my participants even wrote a book. Oh, I thought I'll show it, but I don't think it's laying here. Even wrote a book on what he called the power of depression, because he really felt that it had forced him. So he was also very much from this personal growth idea. It had forced him to change things in his way of being that were eventually made him more himself, but also a better person for his environment. But I'm also interested indeed if there's any clinical people who have much more experience with this, but there does seem to be, for me, there seems to be this sort of intimate connection somehow.
Just sort of a very brief thought, a follow-up. So everything you've said makes very good sense to me. I'm thinking about the difficult situation, at least from a clinical point of view, but actually also from a human point of view, of the person for whom the depression reveals a bleak truth about their own life, which seems insurmountable. Or the depression reveals a bleak truth about the world, which seems insurmountable. So years ago, I saw a book, before I became a psychiatrist, I saw a book which is along the lines of, the world is such a terrible place. How can we sort of work with people to help them cope with it? That might seem rather sort of unduly pessimistic, but it's debate. I mean, clearly within philosophy, there is a strain of thought, particularly in mid-20th century philosophy, which is, one thinks of Sartre and, La Nausée and, in mid-20th century, I guess, post-war, post-Second World War, post-Holocaust and so on, which actually is extremely bleak and finds little solace or comfort in the world. And it's about how to withstand the sort of barbarism and bleakness and meaninglessness of human existence. Now, actually, to some extent, those ideas perhaps have less cultural purchase than they once did. But but nevertheless, I'm just flagging it up as it's in the mix here. I think it's because you use the word authenticity, which is a very interesting word, and I presume your use of it derives from existentialism. So it's just it's reflection. I mean, I'm very keen to hear other people's reflections as well, but I do think that there's such a sort of forward momentum in clinical work to try and help people to recover from depression, that maybe that orientation somewhat effaces the reality testing function of depression. Now, I'm not claiming that all people with depression have realistic appraisals of the world. I'm not arguing that at all, but I'm saying within depression, there might be certain times or moments or aspects for particular individuals when actually there is a revealing function. So it's a reflection, really. Yeah.
And thanks, Quentin. I know Robert's come on screen, but is there anyone who works in a more psychotherapeutic way with depression who wanted to sort of talk a little bit about how they might navigate some of these existential difficulties?
I was going to actually, Chloe, make just a psychotherapy point, actually, but
Sure.
So and then because it just picking up on Quentin and Sanneke, thank you so much for that talk. So just in terms of things that are revealed after time, I mean, Freud's Wolfman was sort of seen as this, and the analysts spend a lot of time thinking about this, and they call it deferred action or après coup. And the idea that basically meanings and people's understanding of things change at different points of their life. And so some precipitant will come along and it will reveal anew something that went before. And so there's a lot of analysis of temporality and how things are not linear, and cycles go back and around, and things are revealed. So that's a sort of concept within psychoanalysis. And the other one, coming back to your idea, the other thing from psychoanalysis that may be relevant, of course, I think we'd all say that depression is many things. And, I think even the psychoanalysts would talk about a constitutional element. But Freud's paper, Mourning and Melancholia, is the sort of key paper, and it's very influential in the sort of Kleinian school of psychoanalysis. And so the idea in that paper is that when someone loses a relationship, maybe it could be a death, it could be someone moving away, it could be the end of a relationship, it could be growing up, but that relationship, which was external between you and something outside, becomes an internal relationship, something between you and an object within your own mind. And if that real relationship was problematic in some way, perhaps too aggressive, too full of whatever emotions made it problematic, when you internalize it into that internal relationship, you're basically beating up yourself as a proxy for the person that you actually have this unfinished business with. And that was basically the idea, Freud's idea of Mourning and Melancholia, which he saw as the cause of depression. So it just relates, it's obviously very different from existentialism and all the various different phenomenology, which we've taken a great interest in this group, but it sort of relates quite closely to some of the things that you were talking about. But there probably are other psychotherapists in the group who can talk more about their clinical use of these concepts.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
That's an invitation, I think. Does anyone from a maybe even a different therapeutic background or discipline, any psychologists or psychotherapists want to talk to this? Whilst you wait for people to possibly formulate another thought or question, if it's okay, I was going to ask a question myself, Sanneke, about this idea of the authentic being in a relational authenticity. And it made me think of the language that's used quite often by a whole range of people, actually, but by depressed patients in particular, of masking. This idea that they go around masking their true self, and then they get so exhausted from doing this that that's when they fall into a depression, because they can no longer put up this front. Or some people will describe that they're depressed all the time, but sometimes they are able to mask it and sometimes they're not. And it made me think of that. Where does that fit into this concept of authenticity, which is relational? What's the sort of block there? How can we schematize that?
Yes, thank you. This is, yes, I didn't talk about that. That was part of the section on being yourself. It is indeed about masking. Lots of people talk about this, and also there's of course the sort of the it's a self how do you say, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because in a sense of not perpetuating thing, in the sense that if you don't show your real self, then you also don't get a real contact or something like that. So you are also not, so the fakeness, so to say, continues. So you're also not in that sense nourished by the relationship, because you are not, it's not, or at least not fully, I mean, you're not expressing yourself, and therefore you're also not in relationship in the same way with the other when you're masking. So making people eventually even more depressed, because they feel even lonelier. Even some people were almost complaining to me about, sort of almost bitter, that they were so good at masking that even good friends wouldn't even notice, and that made them even feel worse, because they hadn't noticed that they were just pretending and so on, and feeling even more lonely afterwards. So and in this relational authenticity, what I think is helpful in this notion is that it really thinks from us as situated beings, and also that even though authenticity is something that has very much to do, right, with what is me, then still it is in relationship with others that we often find out what fits me and what doesn't, and which examples do I want to follow and which examples don't I want to follow. And how that relates to the masking, I think, is that once that the masking itself, how do you say, it's the relation, it's, how do you say that, it sort of negatively affects the relationship, so to say, because it's not between the unmasked you and the other. So thereby it's a way in which you also not allow yourself to have the benefits of being touched, so to say, by others. But but maybe you have a specific thought on this yourself, or an.
Yeah, I mean, I often wonder whether it's the sort of effective evaluation of the relationships that person is involved in, because I think we probably all, but on some social fronts, different social fronts, it's very normal part of being a social being, isn't it? And it often strikes me that when depressed people say that they feel like this is a mask, that this is something that they're very sort of critical of, and they almost wish that they didn't have to. And it may be that it's harder for them than someone who's not depressed, but it may also be that they're evaluating those relationships maybe more negatively anyway, and then they're thinking, that because of that they're not getting the relational comfort or recognition that they feel that they should have, and maybe therefore it's sort of an explanation for that actually the person is not seeing their true self, it's just seeing a mask that they're putting up, and that explains sort of the coldness they feel towards it. I don't know, that's just my thoughts.
Yeah. That's I think that is something that that I find helpful in this, from this viewpoint of an activism, that it really looks at interaction patterns. I think all kinds of therapies and do that, of course, as well. And also that sort of what you instigate, that it sets something in motion that that I think is so recognizable, even in a very sort of banal way, so to say, that if you walk on the street and you're all feeling grumpy and whatever, and you look like this, and then you bump into someone and you think, oh, those people, and they won't go out of the way. And whereas when you're happy and you're walking around with a smile, and then all of a sudden people laugh at you because you're laughing and so on, and then it seems like people are much more friendly and whatever. Yes. So, but also what you said, what I felt was interesting is that people might beat themselves up more over masking, that they sort of have very high standards, as if they should always have to show themselves, and whereas we all do some sort of masking. Well, I do think that if people really use this term masking, that might really signal that it is something else than just being a different person in a different social environment. That if you really feel you're playing a role, I think normally if we are in different environments, we would act differently, but it would, as soon as it feels like you're playing a role, I think that would be signaling that there may be that there's maybe something more going on, or so to say. Maybe that's that it does indeed not, you don't express yourself, you're not able to express yourself, you just have this role or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And does anyone, I can see Quintin's we got another comment or question, but is there anyone who'd like to say anything before Quintin? No, good. Well, then Quintin.
Oh, you're not, we can't hear you.
Fine. I'm just wondering, so one of the things that strikes me listening to your talk and the theme of ambiguity is perhaps the self-doubt or the uncertainty that a person with depression might feel about what is perhaps true or reliable in the way that they think about themselves and the world and other people. And so the theme of authenticity here is in tension with that, because if you're to live authentically in line with your values, then it does raise the question, then how do you know what counts as authenticity, or how do you trust your values? I mean, what values should you privilege? I mean, you might have a value of, say, well, you know, the world is not a very good place, so the value I'm going to live by is just to be as truthful as possible about the injustices in the world and not be dishonest, for example. Or you might doubt you might think, well, I feel the world is a terrible place, or that people are untrustworthy, but is that just my depression talking? And perhaps so depression therefore actually raises in a sort of practical way quite profound epistemological problems for people. It's to do with, well, what's true?
Yes.
So the question of truth is actually inextricably bound up with the question of value, where value means how you should live, how you should act, on what basis should you act, what should you aspire to. So at one point your research kind of, I think, brings out that problem, but if you had to sort of shift gear and think about this, is there any sort of, not prescriptively, but perhaps have you learned anything from the patients about how people can work this out, or is it just too individually variable to generalize about?
Yeah, well, thanks again. I mean, that's correct what you say about this, that the whole search of what is and isn't reliable, and is that my depression talking. There are differences in, when I look at what patients tell me, there are differences in that for some people, the depression is really episodic. So have somewhat clear beginnings and endings, and for some people it's almost more dysthymia, so to say, that, or that they generally feel depressed, you could say, and that they sometimes have proper depressions, but so people differ in that respect. And the question of how you should live and what do you aspire to, in the depression itself, it even comes to the fore. What's the point even? why even continue? I've spoke to several people who are also suicidal. I have an echo now. I don't know if you also hear.
Yeah.
Maybe that. Yeah. Oh, that helps. Thanks, Claudia. So there, the question of how you should live, that also comes. It's sort of, what should you live for? What's there to still live for? And the positive side that people tell me also when they talk about what the depression brought them is that in a sense they are forced to be much more clear about what is of value to them. In terms of where it's basically they can't go on a certain way, they have to change something, and they have to change their job, for instance. It's often the stressful jobs or things like that, but also relationships to parents, for instance. I have to sort of stop seeing my parents because it's just costing me too much. So the depression forces them to make certain choices. So there's different aspects to what you just said. So this thing of this whole epistemological thing, sort of the difficulty of, is this my depression talking or not? People have various tricks, so to say, for themselves to distinguish that, and it's usually has to do with the amount of negative thoughts they have in general. They feel like, okay, I can have some negative thoughts, but if it continues and over a couple of days, and I find myself just thinking negatively, basically about almost everything, okay, then I know I'm sliding into a depressed situation again. And the question of the sort of what value should you privilege? What is then true and reliable? Interestingly enough, people don't have so much doubts about sort of what they want once they are not depressed, in terms of, so people and so values is this really abstract and maybe too abstract term, but so when I asked people, for instance, when they some people actually could feel like, okay, now I'm back again. So when the depression is, so now I feel I'm come out of this depressive episode and I am back again. And I would ask them, okay, what does that mean? And they would say, oh yeah, I can enjoy gardening again, or I can watch the news without being overwhelmed, or I can visit my son who lives in a big city, where otherwise I would just be, how do you say, I would just dread that so much. And they would basically say that they could do the things that they love to do. Yeah, but in terms of family relationships, I've heard several. I think that is really difficult, and some people really had to sort of feel they had to come loose of, how do you say, or they detach themselves from finding out that the ways in which their families worked, the family sort of dynamics worked, that it wasn't working for them, so that they felt the odd one out, or that they sort of that very sort of emotionally stifling or very religious. Also, some people came from very religious backgrounds in which certain things were not allowed, and there people really have these sort of struggles in which they move away from the sort of the value framework in which they grew up, and having to establish new value framework, and that was often, especially I'm thinking now specifically of one person who for whom there was a really long and difficult journey, also because God was, so to say, involved, that he would not just sort of hear the voice of his parent, but also hear the voice of God, or was it the voice of God, or was it actually his parents? So he really had to sort of struggle with that. But there, the sort of the yeah, but that's but then again, what people come back to in terms of values is more have more to do with being in relationships, being in relationships that they felt nourished, how do you say, nourished by, being in relationships, being there for their children, being able to do things that they enjoyed. So yeah, I've been talking for a long time, but I don't know if I actually answered your question at all. But
yeah, so I think I think some of the points, well, actually, I think you have answered it, but it's a sort of multifaceted answer. So I think so actually part of what you're talking about, I think, is self-knowledge, is self-learning about oneself through the process of depression. So, for example, knowing yourself enough to know that if you think negative thoughts about everything, you should start to mistrust your thoughts about things. I mean, so that's a very interesting thing. Also the discovery of what for you is intrinsically valuable in the sense that it confers meaning. That's also a discovery. A discovery about relationships that are not good for you is a discovery. I think one of or a job, etc. So I think actually one of the things you've alluded to there, which I think is very interesting, is about giving up a value system or a belief system of a particular, so religion, or a certain type of religion being an interesting example. There's also, because what's interesting about that with your theme of relationships is actually the embedding of people within systems of relationships, which include cultures and subcultures. So I do wonder actually whether there's also a theme that emerges from your work, how people can, as part of the process of self-discovery and orientation and reorientation in life, to what extent that is also supported by moving into a new or discovering a new subculture, a new supportive context. Whether it's a religious conversion or joining a particular community. Politics is an interesting one. Political activism. I mean, there are certain types of political activity where I think there probably is a very high involvement of people who have struggled with depression, and the way that they manage that is to sort of dedicate themselves to a certain kind of helping others. So people who work for Amnesty International, for example, a human rights organization, people who are tormented by the idea that as we speak, there are people being tortured around the world, sort of thousands of people are being tortured at the moment, and it's just unbearable for them. And so that motivates a quest to kind of mitigate that sense of horror by helping people. So it does. I mean, I think perhaps that is an important theme there, is that actually what are if you can give something up because it's bad for you, what do people also acquire which is good for them? And what is it about what they acquire which is good for them that they identify as valuable? I think it's an interesting question.
Yeah, a very much interesting question. When I think about that, for the people that I spoke to, it tended to be very much in sort of interpersonal relationships. So people would meet someone, often a partner, but it could also be a good friend or something. So someone, so it were often stories rather of finding a person whom they connected to and who helped them in various ways, or who they felt less lonely or could share their story and so on. The amount sort of when it's not not just interpersonal, but just, so to say, one organizational level higher, there are people who become active in self-help groups, so much more focused on the depression itself, so really wanting to help others with depression, so be conveners of self-help groups, and here this identity matter is also, I think, that's also, I think, a very interesting relationship my guess now would be, but this is, I may regret that, so this is maybe too, but it seems, I think for some people you can really see sort of at least a process in which the disorder and the diagnosis, and in which sort of the recognition of it has a very important role initially in sort of making sense of your own experiences, in terms of recognition, in terms of sort of depression is a disease. I've heard that so often. Depression is a real disease. And yet there are also people who have sort of moved away from this identification, and who feel that that's by focusing too much on them being depressed, that they're actually not helping themselves anymore, I should say. I mean, that was helpful at one point, but it's not any longer, because they feel it sort of, it narrows down their identity too much. Yes, so what you give up, what's bad, and what is good for us, or what is good for you. The stories I've heard are more sort of really interpersonal, close by friends, partners.
I see Rob there. I assume Rob has a comment to make, but before, if I could just respond to what you'd said. So it does make me think, actually, that I'm interested if you were to take your research approach, your methodology, and actually apply it cross-culturally. So, for example, the people in societies for whom the concept of depression as a disease is not readily available, or less readily available, for whom there are other conceptual resources through which suffering and anguish are conceptualized, and actually other resources culturally or interpersonally through which suffering is framed and reframed, and which points ways out of suffering, and actually and what counts as authenticity, and how authenticity is framed, is articulated differently.
Yes,
I think that would be very interesting, because it would because there's always a sort of concern with this type of research, that actually what we're doing is we're learning a lot about essentially sort of post-industrial Western societies from people economically embedded in a certain way, who are enculturated and socialized systemically in certain ways, which profoundly shapes how people experience themselves, how distress is articulated, how people navigate ways out of it, or not. And there's a sort of kind of such a profound patterning that of all of this, that the concept of the individual just really is not particularly helpful, because you just can't disembed people from the totality of within which they're embedded. So anyway, that's just a thought. I think for comparative purposes, if you were to say, go to a working class neighborhood in Cairo, for example, and do the same research, or Morocco, that would be very interesting.
Okay, Rob.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you've said a lot, Quentin, so I'll try and extend where you got to rather than sort of go back to the beginning. So I guess I was thinking, you were talking about cross-culturally. Yes, I think, the anthropologists did a lot of work, looking at how the shaman or the healer explicitly doesn't focus on the individual, but focuses on all the social relationships, say, in the community, and tries to modulate those to heal the individual. And then right at the other end, you've got the philosopher in the armchair, reflecting on themselves, as if there's no relationship with anyone at all. And I think I was reading somewhere that the vast majority of philosophers in the Western tradition were single men, so not even relationships, which is sort of interesting. And I guess clearly most of us are somewhere in the middle, and I suppose a healthy person, if we think not just in terms of culture, is able to balance something about finding authenticity and their values within themselves, but also within their relationships and the groups they're a part of. And I think you're absolutely right to emphasize that. And in psychopathology, that goes wrong in many ways. And I think people lose trust in themselves and also lose trust in their relationships, at being able to orientate themselves in, you know, who they are, you know, what their illness is and what they believe in and what they want. And I think that's one of the reasons that when people come to see mental health professionals like us or, you know, psychotherapists, they can put so much on it, because the hope is to find someone who can help them navigate in that interpersonal domain again and tell them what is what. So I think a lot of the questions that are being asked aren't concrete questions such as, you know, is it my brain? Is it it's a more metaphorical level of trying to, as you say, trying to work out where you are in terms of an authentic self who believes in such and such and wants such and such. And I think if we can be more orientated in that way as mental health professionals, we're closer to what people are asking for, rather than just trying to work out, you know, is it their brain and do they want medication? Anyway.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Rob. We're probably coming towards the end of our time, but I will give an opportunity to anyone who's not yet asked a question or have a comment. Please feel free to put your hand up or type it in the chat. Otherwise, I'll just say thank you again to Sanneke. I don't know if you had any last thoughts after what what Rob had to say there.
No, it's basically in agreement with both what Quentin and Robert pointed out, to that this focus on an isolated individual is just not helpful focus in a sense, if you want to understand how that person is embedded and how they are related to others. And yeah, what I was thinking of is something that I really liked by a Dutch phenomenological psychiatrist, Van den Berg, who wrote about psychopathology being basically about loneliness, sort of existential loneliness, feeling cut off from others. And the different psychopathologies have that in different ways, but that it comes about that the goal is finding connection again, and finding connection again in various ways. Yeah. So I think about that. And
great.
Yeah. And thanks for all your input. It was actually very helpful for me. Yeah, thanks very much for your contributions and thoughts.
Well, thank you so much, Sanneke. And yeah, it's really nice to see these ability to reflect on depression through this lens of an active psychiatry and phenomenology combined. So yeah, thank you for bringing us that. I really enjoyed it. Yeah. Bye and good night, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.